On the night of December 31st, 1998, Europe celebrated as if it had finally escaped its own history. In Frankfurt's glass towers and Brussels' marble halls, champagne corks echoed into the cold air, while finance ministers smiled for cameras, bureaucrats embraced, and journalists spoke in reverent tones about destiny. There was a genuine belief that this moment marked the end of Europe's long and violent past, a continent that for centuries had tried and failed to unify itself through force. Charlemagne had tried, Napoleon had tried, Hitler had tried, all had failed. This time, Europe believed it had discovered a cleaner, more civilized weapon, not armies, not borders, but money. At the stroke of midnight, as the calendar turned to January 1st, 1999, something unprecedented occurred. Proud, ancient nations voluntarily erased their own currencies. The German mark, the French franc, the Italian lira, the Spanish peseta, symbols older than modern democracy itself, were quietly deleted. In their place emerged something new, intangible, electronic, and abstract: the euro. To Europe's political class, this was peace encoded into software. A shared currency, they argued, would make war impossible. Countries that shared a wallet would never turn guns on each other. Prosperity was promised. Stability was guaranteed. Global power was assured. Europe, they said, would finally stand as an equal to the United States. What they did not say, perhaps what they did not fully understand, was that in creating this unity, they were also dismantling the most important tool a nation has to survive economic reality. They were not just building a union, they were building a trap. To see why the euro would become so dangerous, it is necessary to understand what money actually is. Most people think of money as cash, numbers on a screen, or something you earn, save, and spend. But for a sovereign nation, money is something far more powerful. It is a shock absorber. When an economy overheats, money tightens. When recession hits, money loosens. When exports collapse, the currency falls, making a country's goods cheaper to the rest of the world. This is not a flaw in the system. It is how economies survive. Before the euro, every European nation possessed this tool, and no country depended on it more than Italy. Italy was never a model of fiscal discipline. Its governments were unstable, its spending excessive, its debt enormous. By the logic of economic textbooks, Italy should have collapsed decades earlier. But it didn't. The reason was simple. Italy had the lira. Whenever wages rose too high or Italian products lost competitiveness, the Bank of Italy reached for the printing press. The lira weakened. Exports became cheaper overnight, and factories stayed open. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't responsible by German standards. But it worked. It allowed Italy to remain one of the world's largest manufacturing economies, despite chronic political chaos. That printing press was Italy's escape hatch. And on January 1st, 1999, Italy handed that escape hatch to someone else. The design of the euro was no accident. The European Central Bank was placed in Frankfurt with a distinctly German philosophy, mission, and fear. Germany's history with inflation was traumatic. In the 1920s, hyperinflation wiped out savings, destroyed the middle class, and poisoned democracy itself. For Germans, inflation was not just an economic variable, it was a moral evil. So Germany demanded a currency that would never bend. No devaluation, no flexibility, no mercy. The euro would be hard money. What Germany did not fully acknowledge, or perhaps did not care to acknowledge, was that Southern Europe was built differently. Productivity levels differed, labor markets differed, political cultures differed. Yet the euro imposed one interest rate, one currency, one policy on 19 economies, all trapped in a single system with no exit. In its first decade, the euro looked like a miracle. Interest rates across Europe converged. Suddenly, Greece could borrow almost as cheaply as Germany, as could Spain, Portugal, and Italy. Markets assumed that all Eurozone debt was equally safe. The reasoning was simple. Germany was in the room. Before the euro, Greece paid interest rates close to 20%, a natural break that punished excess borrowing. After the euro, those rates collapsed to around 3%. It felt like free money. Government spent as if the bill would never arrive. Public sector wages soared, retirement ages fell, Massive infrastructure projects were launched without real demand. Spain built cities without people. Ireland built homes without buyers. Greece expanded a public sector it could never afford, and no one stopped them because markets believed the euro had erased risk. Welcome to part 2 of our series on the euro, where we delve deeper into the economic landscape of Europe, focusing on Germany's pivotal role and the growing disparities that emerged within the Eurozone. After the initial optimism surrounding the euro's introduction, Germany, with its robust manufacturing base and export-oriented economy, quickly solidified its position as the economic powerhouse of Europe. Its industries, highly competitive and efficient, thrived under the common currency, benefiting from stable exchange rates and reduced transaction costs across the Eurozone. This economic strength allowed Germany to maintain low inflation and a strong fiscal position, often advocating for austerity and fiscal discipline among its partners. However, this success story was not uniformly shared. While Northern European countries, often characterized by strong industrial sectors and prudent fiscal policies, generally prospered, a different picture emerged in Southern Europe. Nations like Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, with less competitive industries and often higher public debt, found themselves struggling to keep pace. The common currency meant they could no longer devalue their own currencies to boost exports or make their goods more attractive, a traditional tool for economic adjustment. This led to growing trade imbalances, with Southern European countries importing more from the North, particularly Germany, than they exported. Their economies became increasingly reliant on borrowing, often from Northern European banks, to finance their consumption and public spending. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Cheap credit fueled consumption booms, which in turn led to higher imports and further indebtedness. The structural differences between the North and South, exacerbated by the euro, created a two-speed Europe. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, originating in the U.S. subprime mortgage market, but its tremors quickly spread across the Atlantic. European banks, heavily exposed to U.S. subprime mortgage-backed securities, faced massive losses. Confidence evaporated, interbank lending froze, and a severe liquidity crisis gripped the financial system. This quickly morphed into a sovereign debt crisis, particularly in Southern Europe, as governments struggled to bail out their banks and finance their deficits. The European Central Bank stepped in with emergency measures, but the crisis necessitated painful austerity programs and international bailouts, further deepening the economic and social divides. The legacy of this period continues to shape the Eurozone, highlighting the ongoing challenges of managing a common currency across diverse economies. The Eurozone, a beacon of economic integration, faced its ultimate test in the years leading up to the 2008 global financial crisis. This period saw the emergence of a massive bubble, fueled by mispriced risk and a stark divergence in economic fortunes across its member states. At the heart of this divergence was Germany, an export powerhouse. Following the Hartz-IV reforms between 2003 and 2005, Germany implemented wage restraint policies that suppressed domestic demand, making its exports incredibly competitive on the global stage. German exports soared from 583 billion euros in 2000 to an astounding 969 billion euros by 2007. This led to a current account surplus that grew from 0% of GDP in 1999 to 7.4% of GDP, or 156 billion euros, by 2007. Unemployment in Germany simultaneously fell from 11.7% in 2005 to 7.5% in 2008, painting a picture of robust economic health and stability. Meanwhile, Southern European nations experienced a credit-fueled boom. Spain's housing construction sector exploded, with building permits rising from 250,000 in 2000 to a peak of 800,000 in 2006. Housing prices in Spain tripled between 2000 and 2007, and private debt to GDP surged from 130% in 2000 to 220% by 2008. This was a clear sign of an unsustainable asset bubble. Greece, in particular, masked its true financial state. Through currency swaps with Goldman Sachs in 2001, it hid significant public debt. While officially reported at 103% of GDP in 2007, the actual figures were much higher and deficits were deliberately obscured. Portugal and Italy followed similar patterns of consumption and debt binges, with bank lending across these nations growing at an alarming rate of 20 to 30% annually. A critical factor was the mispricing of risk. Credit default swap spreads, which measure the cost of insuring against default, converged dramatically. Greece and Germany, despite their vastly different economic fundamentals, both had spreads of around 10 basis points before 2007. This convergence meant that markets perceived the risk of lending to these nations as virtually identical, leading to AAA credit ratings for countries that were, in reality, diverging significantly. The one-size-fits-all monetary policy of the European Central Bank, maintaining historically low interest rates post-Euro launch, further fueled these asset bubbles in periphery nations. Capital inflows from the global savings glut, surplus countries like Germany, China, and oil exporters, lent cheaply to deficit nations, creating a dangerous cycle. The final moments before the crisis were marked by a series of seismic events originating in the U.S. subprime mortgage market. Bear Stearns was bailed out in March 2008 with $30 billion in Fed aid. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were placed into conservatorship on September 7, 2008, requiring over $200 billion in support. Just days later, on September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, holding $613 billion in assets. The ripple effect was immediate and devastating for the Eurozone. The interbank lending market froze, with the Euribor OIS spread spiking to 100 basis points in October 2008. Ireland, facing imminent collapse, guaranteed its banks on September 29, 2008, taking on a staggering €440 billion liability. The ECB injected over €400 billion in liquidity to stabilize the system. Eurozone GDP growth plummeted from 3.3% in 2006 to a mere 0.5% in 2008, and Spain's unemployment rate jumped from 8% in 2007 to 11% in 2008. These events exposed deep imbalances. Germany's surplus funded periphery deficits, with intra-Eurozone lending reaching €2 trillion net between 2002 and 2008. The sudden stop of capital post-Lehman revealed the fragility of a system built on mispriced risk and unchecked credit. By the summer of 2012, the Eurozone was seconds away from disaster. Bond markets were in open revolt. Italian and Spanish yields were climbing toward levels that no government could sustain, and banks across southern Europe were bleeding deposits by the hour. This was not ordinary panic or market overreaction. It was systemic failure unfolding in real time. The architecture of the euro itself was cracking, and Europe had exhausted nearly every option it had left. For 3 long years, European leaders had responded to the crisis with hesitation and ritual. Emergency summits were convened. Carefully worded statements were issued. Half measures were announced and celebrated as breakthroughs. Each intervention bought a little time, but none addressed the core problem. Markets no longer believed political promises. They believed numbers, and the numbers were unforgiving. A monetary union without a lender of last resort was mathematically unstable. Everyone inside the system knew it. No one dared to say it out loud, until one man did. On July 26, 2012, the president of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, stood before an audience in London. Financial markets around the world were watching closely, desperate for any sign that Europe still had control. Draghi delivered a sentence that would become one of the most important in modern economic history. "Within our mandate," he said, "the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough." There were no details, no new laws, no treaty changes. Just 3 sentences. And yet, in that moment, everything changed. Those words mattered because, for the first time since the euro's creation, the ECB implied something revolutionary: that it would behave like a real central bank, that it would not allow sovereign bond markets to collapse, that it would create money if necessary to stop panic. This was never supposed to happen. The euro had been designed specifically to prevent such behavior. Germany's fear of inflation had shaped the system into something rigid, rule-bound, and deliberately inflexible. The ECB was meant to be disciplined, mechanical, and unemotional. With a single speech, Draghi broke that design, not with action, but with credibility. The ECB did not even need to intervene immediately. Markets believed it would. And in finance, belief is everything. Bond yields fell sharply. Capital returned. Bank runs slowed and then stopped. Panic evaporated almost overnight. This was a confidence shock, but in reverse. Fear disappeared not because Europe's problems were solved, but because the referee had finally stepped onto the field. What followed was unprecedented. Quietly and methodically, the ECB introduced programs that rewrote the rules of the Eurozone. Outright monetary transactions signaled unlimited support for sovereign bonds. Long-term refinancing operations flooded banks with cheap liquidity. Later came full-scale quantitative easing. In plain terms, the ECB began creating money to stabilize the system. Trillions of euros, injected slowly, technocratically, and with carefully crafted legal language that blurred the edge of what was officially allowed. Yet this is the most misunderstood chapter of the euro crisis. Europe did not heal. It froze. Like a patient whose bleeding has been stopped but whose organs remain damaged. The system survived without truly recovering. Debt levels were not meaningfully reduced. Productivity did not surge. The deep structural imbalances between North and South remained intact. But time passed, and as time passed, the crisis began to feel distant. To keep the system alive, interest rates were pushed to zero and then below zero. This new reality carried consequences no one had voted for. Savers were punished. Pension systems came under strain. Asset prices exploded. Stock markets rose. Real estate soared. Inequality widened. Europe avoided collapse by inflating almost everything except wages. Cheap money kept failing companies alive. Banks rolled over bad loans instead of writing them off. Governments postponed difficult reforms. Why confront painful realities when the ECB would intervene? This gave rise to what economists began calling zombie economies. Firms that survived not because they were productive or innovative, but because money was essentially free. Productivity stagnated. Innovation slowed. The Eurozone became calm, stable, and increasingly weak. For American audiences, the contrast is striking. After 2008, the United States allowed destruction. Banks failed. Housing prices collapsed. Debt was written off. The process was brutal and deeply unpopular, but it worked. Europe chose preservation instead. No widespread defaults. No meaningful restructuring. No reset. Just support layered on top of support. Chaos was avoided, but at a steep cost. Europe traded growth for stability, and over time, stability hardened into stagnation. When economic pressure does not disappear, it mutates. Across Europe, frustration turned into political anger. Populist movements surged. Nationalist parties gained ground. Anti-EU sentiment spread, not because people rejected Europe as an idea, but because Europe no longer delivered progress. The euro had survived. Faith in the project had not. No serious economist disputes that Mario Draghi saved the euro. But in doing so, he proved something else just as important. The euro could only survive by breaking its own rules. And that leaves behind a dangerous, unanswered question. If survival requires permanent emergency measures, is the system truly stable or merely postponed? By the late 2010s, Europe appeared calm. Markets were quiet. Interest rates hovered near zero. The crisis felt over. Then came a shock no economic model had predicted. A global pandemic. And this time, Europe would not just bend the rules. It would abandon them entirely. In Part 5, the story turns to COVID, how it forced Europe into debt sharing for the first time, and why that moment may have changed the euro forever.
In September 2008, a single investment bank collapsed in New York. Lehman Brothers was not supposed to matter to Europe. European leaders dismissed it as an American problem, an Anglo-Saxon crisis born from reckless Wall Street excess. They spoke confidently, almost dismissively, certain that the shock would remain contained across the Atlantic. They were wrong, because the moment Lehman fell, something far more important than any bank froze. Trust vanished, and when trust disappears from the financial system, credit does not slow down, it dies instantly. For nearly a decade, money had flowed effortlessly from Northern Europe to the South. Banks in Frankfurt and Paris lent to Athens, Madrid, and Rome with barely a second thought. That flow did not taper off gently. It did not pause. It slammed into a wall. Lending stopped. Investors demanded repayment. Bond markets turned hostile overnight. Economists call this a sudden stop, and for countries dependent on continuous borrowing, a sudden stop is not a setback. It is a death sentence. As panic spread through global markets, investors began asking a question they had not seriously considered since 1999. Who is actually responsible for this debt? For years, everyone had assumed that Germany ultimately stood behind the euro. That assumption was never written down, never legally guaranteed, but it was believed. In 2008, that belief cracked. There was no German backstop, no shared treasury, no federal guarantee. Each country was responsible for its own obligations. And suddenly, Greece no longer looked like Germany. It looked exactly like Greece. The illusion collapsed completely in late 2009 when Greece's newly elected government revealed the truth. The budget deficit was not 3%, as previously reported. It was closer to 15%. For years, the numbers had been manipulated, deferred, hidden in plain sight. Markets reacted instantly. Greek bond yields exploded. Borrowing became impossible. The country was insolvent. In that moment, the euro's fundamental design flaw was fully exposed to the world. In a normal sovereign nation, such a crisis would trigger devaluation. The currency would fall, exports would become competitive, tourism would surge, and debt would be inflated away over time. But Greece had no currency of its own. It could not devalue. It could not print money. It could not stimulate its economy. Greece was trapped inside the euro, stripped of every traditional escape hatch. With no monetary tools left, Greece was forced into what economists politely call internal devaluation. In reality, this meant something brutally simple. Wages were cut, pensions were slashed, workers were fired, and the economy was deliberately shrunk. If a country cannot make its currency cheaper, it must make its people cheaper. This was not abstract theory. It was suffering engineered by policy. By 2010, Greece was effectively bankrupt, and control shifted away from elected institutions toward a new, unelected authority. Not soldiers or tanks arrived, but accountants. They were known as the Troika, the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. These three institutions assumed direct control over Greek economic policy. Budgets were rewritten in Brussels. Laws were dictated from Frankfurt. Greek democracy continued to exist, but only as long as election results did not threaten the euro itself. European leaders told their citizens they were saving Greece. This was the biggest lie of the crisis. The bailout money did not rebuild the Greek economy. It passed through Athens and flowed straight back to French and German banks that had lent recklessly in the first place. This was not a rescue. It was a financial extraction. Greek citizens absorbed the losses. Northern banks were protected. In exchange for loans Greece could never realistically repay, the Troika imposed austerity. Not reform, punishment. Minimum wages were cut. Pensions were reduced again and again. Hospitals ran out of basic medicine. Schools shut off heating during winter. Unemployment surged past 25%. Youth unemployment crossed 50%. An entire generation lost its future. This devastation was not an accident. It was the policy. When Greek leaders attempted to resist, the European Central Bank revealed the full extent of its power. It threatened to cut liquidity to Greek banks, to shut down ATMs, to collapse the financial system itself. Money, the lifeblood of modern society, was weaponized. In that moment, the reality became undeniable. Within the Eurozone, democracy is secondary to financial stability. Sovereignty ends where liquidity begins. Greece was only the beginning. Investors turned their attention to Portugal, Ireland, Spain, and Italy. The cruel acronym PIIGS entered the financial vocabulary, revealing more truth than policymakers were willing to admit. Interest rates spiked. Capital fled from south to north. Banks weakened everywhere. Italy, the Eurozone's third-largest economy, drifted dangerously close to the edge. And unlike Greece, Italy was too large to rescue. Italy's crisis was not driven by reckless spending, but by stagnation. For years, growth had stalled. Productivity flatlined. Industry slowly eroded. Debt accumulated silently. The euro had locked Italy into a currency it could not compete within, and now the bill had arrived. Bond yields surged, markets demanded reform, and Brussels intervened. In 2011, Italy's elected prime minister was effectively forced out, not by voters, but by markets. A technocratic government led by a former EU official was installed. There were no tanks in the streets, no dramatic overthrow. It was a coup executed with spreadsheets. Italy's budget was no longer decided in Rome. It was decided elsewhere. Across southern Europe, the human cost mounted. Spanish youth fled abroad in search of opportunity. Portugal hollowed out. Ireland exported its workforce. The euro was no longer a shared dream. It had become a sorting machine. Capital flowed north. Talent flowed north. Debt stayed south. The divide widened and hardened. By 2012, the euro stood on the edge of collapse. One more shock, one more panic, one more default, and the entire system could implode. And then, at the final moment, three words changed everything.
Between 2025 and 2026, the world did not experience a dramatic crash. There was no single day of panic, no collapsing ticker symbols, no modern Lehman moment to mark the transition. That was precisely what made this reset so unsettling. Instead of chaos, there was a slow and creeping realization that the system still functioned, but no longer for the same people. The machinery of global finance kept moving, yet its rewards quietly shifted elsewhere. When COVID struck, it accomplished what decades of crisis could not. Europe was forced into a choice it had postponed since the euro's creation: collapse or deeper integration. This time, hesitation was not an option. Entire economies were shut down by law, debt levels exploded overnight, and governments ran out of room to maneuver. The old rules could not survive a crisis of this scale, and so Europe crossed a line it had sworn never to cross. For the first time, debt was shared, quietly, carefully, and without the language of revolution. The European Union issued joint debt. It was not branded as a transfer union. It was not celebrated as fiscal integration. But in practice, that is exactly what it was. Northern Europe guaranteed Southern Europe. Germany crossed its final red line, not out of ideology, but necessity. Without this step, the euro itself would have collapsed. The pandemic did not create European unity, it forced it. At the same time, the European Central Bank stopped pretending it was merely a referee. Through massive debt purchases, emergency lending programs, and unlimited liquidity, the ECB became the system itself. By 2022, Europe was no longer governed primarily through parliaments and elections, but through balance sheets. Monetary power eclipsed political authority, not through conspiracy, but through necessity. Europe survived COVID, but survival came at a cost that was easy to miss. Debt reached historic highs. Growth remained anemic. Demographics continued to deteriorate. The Eurozone emerged stable, but brittle like glass. Strong as long as conditions remained perfect, fragile the moment they didn't. While Europe focused on preserving the old structure, the rest of the world began to reset. The United States once again chose disruption. Interest rates rose. Liquidity was withdrawn. Asset prices were forced to reprice. The process was painful and politically unpopular, but it flushed excess from the system. By 2025, America was not universally richer, but it was liquid. And liquidity, more than paper wealth, is power. China took a different path. It did not crash. It slowed deliberately. The property bubble deflated quietly. Debt was restructured internally. Growth shifted away from speculative real estate and toward industry and strategic capacity. China did not dominate the old system. It positioned itself for the next one. Meanwhile, largely ignored by headlines, Africa became strategically central. Critical minerals, rare earths, and energy transition inputs pulled global attention southward. Capital did not flow into Africa out of generosity, but necessity, as supply chains fractured and geopolitical risk increased. Africa did not suddenly become rich, but it became indispensable. And in geopolitics, necessity matters more than sympathy. Europe's real problem was never debt. Other countries carried more. The issue was structure: high regulation, aging populations, low tolerance for risk, weak productivity growth, and a shared currency that eliminated adjustment mechanisms combined into a rigid system. The euro removed volatility, but it also removed flexibility. And without flexibility, adaptation becomes impossible. This is where the story of the rich quietly going broke comes full circle. Wealth did not disappear. Liquidity did. Years of cheap money had inflated assets that could no longer be exited when conditions changed. Commercial real estate, venture capital, and heavily leveraged equities did not collapse overnight. They froze. And frozen capital is effectively dead capital. Out of this freeze emerged a new elite. Not louder, not necessarily richer on paper, but liquid, cash-heavy, lightly leveraged, mobile, and patient. They didn't chase returns at the top. They waited. And when others were forced to sell discreetly, they bought. This is not a conspiracy. It is how every economic reset has always worked. Artificial intelligence did not cause this reset, but it locked it in. Automation rewarded scale. Productivity gains flowed to capital faster than labor. Winners pulled away more quickly than ever before. Europe lagged in adaptation. The United States adjusted. China copied, optimized, and deployed. AI did not invent inequality. It made it permanent. For American viewers, Europe's story is not one of failure, but of design choices. Europe chose stability over adaptation. America chose volatility over stagnation. Neither path is painless, but only one renews itself. The euro never truly failed. It succeeded at exactly what it was designed to do: prevent collapse, enforce discipline, and preserve order. What it failed to do was more important: create growth that people could actually feel. Systems that survive by suppressing volatility eventually suppress opportunity as well. By 2026, the global order had not collapsed. It had resorted. Liquidity replaced leverage. Flexibility replaced rigidity. Optionality replaced permanence. The old rules did not shatter. They expired quietly. History rarely ends with explosions. More often, it ends with adjustments. And when people say that nothing happened after 2025, they are wrong. Everything happened, just slowly enough that only those paying attention noticed.